This video is going to introduce the UltraLight from heavy artillery, show some of its basic usage, and go over all of the various parameters and controls that are built in. Don't be intimidated by the long list. They are all fairly straightforward, and many are just mirrors and alternative controls for things like the integral light controls from the built-in Unreal lights. So yeah, let's just have a quick look here at the first light that's in the scene. Just a top light. It's already been pre-configured for a few things. This light will be in the scene when you first open the file. For now, though, we will delete it and start with a fresh one. The UltraLight can be found in the heavy artillery folder once it's installed. You can go to the lights folder, UltraLight, and it is a blueprint style. Just drag and drop that into the scene. And just pull that up above and rotate it around. You will note that we're in path tracing mode. It does also work in lit mode, but there is a big difference in the luminosity values between the path tracing system and the real-time render system. So while it does work for both, the same configuration will not work for both. So it's important to decide whether you're rendering with the path tracer or the standard real-time renderer before you get too deeply into it. Obviously, you can adjust it later and balance them out if you decide to change your mind. It's just more convenient if you have a clear goal up front. So generally speaking, my focus in the work that we do is on the highest possible quality and aiming for the most realistic result we can. So path tracing is always my preferred choice whenever we can use that. The UltraLight works very well with Lumen. It also works with standard ray tracing. You can feel free to switch back and forth between the two. Generally speaking, the higher quality result at this point is still found with the traditional hardware ray traced options versus Lumen, but you can feel free to experiment with both. The UltraLight combines an emissive plane, a light plane, as well as integral Unreal Engine standard lights, a rect light, spotlight, and a point light. You can use them just as regular lights without having to use the light plane. But the advantage to having a light plane is that you can control your reflections separate from your light source. That can be a little more optimal for performance, but also allow a lot more creative control. Sometimes it's nice to just use a really simple light source like a point light to cast illumination, and then use the light plane just to create the reflections that you want. When photographing or creating a render of things like shiny objects, a significant amount of what you're doing is more about setting up beautiful and interesting reflections than it is about light. Light is obviously an important component, but when looking at a shiny object, the form is defined in large part by the reflections. So in a sense, what you're photographing or rendering is an image of your light source reflected in your shape, and using that reflection to define the form of the subject. So light is important, but reflections are often more important. Having these two elements separated gives you the option to control each to an extremely fine degree. For now, we'll just use the rect light. Obviously, the rect light creates the softest shadows by default, but we don't necessarily need to use the rect light in order to get soft shadows. One of the other reasons we often use a rect light is to create those large and area-style reflections. But with the light plane, you don't actually need to do that. You can use a spotlight and just soften up the shadows. From the spotlight controls, which are down here, we'll come back to this in a moment. But by softening that up, you can create the lighting with the spotlight, which allows you all those tools that are only part of the spotlight, the cone angles, etc. And using the shadow softness to create more natural-looking shadows for your light source, as implied by the light plane up above. Because the lights are all in the same place, let's go to activation. At the top level, point light is on. Bring the point light intensity up just a little bit more to be clear. Because the lights are co-located at the same point in space, you are able to have all of them active at the same time and not have confusing cross shadows. Let's reset that back. Actually, you can just turn that on, turn that off. We'll just use the rect light for now. So the first section, again, is the activation. It allows you to turn everything off and on. The gobo plane, as its default position here, is not going to be terribly useful. We'll come back to that after and show you just how powerful that tool actually is. The two-sided light plane is just a way of activating a two-sided light, in case that's useful. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Skipping over targeting for just a moment, we have the intensities, which we've already looked at. Each one is controlled separately. They're all located here rather than in their individual control areas for convenience, because it's sometimes simpler to have them in one spot when you're fine-tuning the relative balance of the brightness of the reflection to the brightness of the light. You can tone down one but maintain brightness in the other, or vice versa. Have a strong reflection, casting just a little bit of light. All lights default to 0, so if you first activate them and don't see anything happening, just come down and make sure that you actually have some intensity in here. The master intensity affects all of them, so if we just put some power back into that light. The light plane intensity and all three lights are multiplied by the master light intensity, so if you create a balance between the light plane and the lights, and you're happy with the relative ratio of those two things, and you just want to make it a little brighter or darker, the master intensity override provides a way of controlling both at the same time. It's also handy just to use it as a quick off switch, rather than having to dig around and look for effect world switches or hitting an actor, etc. Targeting. Targeting is a little bit clunky. It's there as a convenience. I don't use it terribly often. Activating it is the first step, and then you need to choose a target mesh. You can use the picker and select an object in the viewport. You can also choose from the list. It only works with meshes, and it will focus the light on the pivot point. You'll notice sometimes that it will skip around a little. Yeah, it's just a limited system. It's not the best. Maybe something I'll be able to improve over time, but for now, it's just there as a convenience. Once you have the light positioned, if you no longer want it to be targeted, you can simply turn it off, and it will begin to act like a normal light. And you can switch anytime you like, turn it back on, and it will snap that orientation back into place. And not something I use a ton, but it's there. The next section that we come to, the global light plane adjustments. These provide overall adjustments to the light plane texture, which is controlled by the base color, the texture, and all the procedural gradients. Each one has its own set of controls that we'll come to. Global contrast, brightness, saturation, and tint provides an overlay on all of them that allows you to control them together. This will be more apparent, and the use for this will be more obvious once we've put some procedural gradients in there. So we'll come back to this one in a sec. Visibility and alpha. Similar to the point above, using composite as alpha is something that will be more obvious once we apply some textures. It's not going to do anything right now. A global contrast for that is available here. Backface visible is kind of a handy one though. If we're looking around and working in the viewport, by default this is turned off. It can sometimes be a little difficult to see where our lights are in the scene. Obviously the icon is there, but when you have a bunch of them in a large scene, it can be hard to spot. So having a backface visible option allows you to create a light that you can spot in the viewport and see from around the scene and select with a little more ease. Again, just a convenience tool. The shadow section provides individual control over the lights as well as the shadow plane. By default, lights are casting shadows and the plane is not. The next three sections are the light controls: rec light, spotlight, and point light. There are some common controls for each one and some individual that are relevant only to that light. For example, with the rec light, we have the barn door length and angle, as well as source width and height. Source width and height, when set to 100, are matched 1-to-1 to the light plane itself. By adjusting the size of the light plane, the source width and height of the rectangle light are matched. If you needed, for whatever reason, to separate those and have the source width and height, be a smaller light relative to the light plane or a much bigger light relative to the light plane, that option is here. And just by resetting these factory default, they will go back to being 1-to-1 with the light plane. Color, I'm going to come back to in just a moment. Let's turn that off, turn on the spotlight for a second. With the spotlight and with the point light, you'll note that there is a shadow softness control. This shadow softness controls both the source radius and soft source radius. So whether you're using ray tracing or not, you have a way of softening the shadows with a single controller. The source length is only going to be relevant if for whatever reason you want to use the spotlight without the light plane acting as the specular reflection. This will change the specular reflection per the normal lights. In order to access that or that, for that to do anything, you're going to have to go into the component level and reactivate specular scale. For now, they're all dialed off so that the specular is created by the light plane, but it's easy enough to turn that back on if you wanted to use it the other way for whatever reason. The next few sections are all about the light plane. The light plane texture base color, this is your main control for the look of the light plane itself. Base color just tints the light. Just to come back to, as I said, come back to the lights. The base color here acts as a multiplier on the light sources as well, so that the light is tinted to match the reflection, but the light color here can still be controlled separately. So for whatever reason you wanted the light to have a different feel, let's turn it off. Let's use the spotlight. For whatever reason you wanted the light to have a different feel, that's easily done here. Extreme. Right. So that gives you quite a level of fine control. Typically, you're going to want to leave these neutral white and let the base color drive the light. So that's how it's set up by default, but very easy to change. If you look at the reflection here, you'll see that it's got that classic CG look, just a solid white reflection. This is what you would get with a rect light. Having the light plane texturable gives you the option to create things that look a lot more photorealistic. So let's have a look at that. By default, the light comes with two preloaded textures. Both have been kindly provided by Diffuse 3D. Link will be in the description below if you want to grab the rest of their set. They have an excellent high-res, high-quality set of images. HDRI and at least 10-stop range. Very, very useful. Of course, the purpose of the UltraLight is to give you the opportunity to break away from textures so that you don't necessarily need them. You can create your own look and feel without being dependent on textures, but textures are a very quick way to get something that looks much more realistic. We've got the medium softbox and the parabolic reflector, again provided by Diffuse 3D. You can see it creates much more interesting reflections than just the straight up cube. Square of the rect light. Texture can be inverted. Not super handy in most cases, but it's there. The preloaded ones are in this texture list, but you can feel free to grab any texture you like from your own collection. Just have to choose Custom Map here, and that'll activate this custom texture list. Texture opacity allows you to blend the texture in with the base color. You will note that the texture is tinted by the base color automatically, so if you want it to be neutral, you just have to snap that back out. If you wanted, for whatever reason, to have your light still tinted and not have the texture tinted, this switch here, tint texture, which is on by default, will switch that tint multiplier off from the texture so you can maintain the color integrity of your texture separate from the light source. Below here are some controls for the texture itself. Controls for brightness, contrast, saturation. In this case, it's not super handy because there is no color, but if we have an image that does have some color, then this gives you a way to overdrive or dial it back as needed. Blur is self-explanatory. Blur extents and radial steps are two quality controls. These both drive parameters in a spiral blur texture node in the material. Just two different effects on quality. If you find it's not performing enough, you can drop that quality down with obvious results. This can actually be useful to create even different pixelated type effects or just as an optimization. Depending on how visible your reflection is, this might be where you can save some cycles. Standard defaults of 64 and 8 provide an excellent starting point for quality. Global texture scale gives you a unified XY tiling control. Then you have separate XY tiling control. Sometimes it's easier if you want to stretch, and then you want the whole thing to be up and down. It's nice to have a single control to access that. Texture offsets, very straightforward UV manipulation stuff, rotation. So having all of these together provides an incredible amount of control over the texture and look of your light source. Set it back. The next section, just zoom in a little bit here, is light plane texture noise. It's called noise, and it's preloaded with the noise, but it doesn't have to be. This can actually just be a second overlay texture if you want to make a more complex surface. It's a multiplier for the texture above. You just turn this on. You can see what it's doing. This is actually pretty handy for creating variations in your light source, or just breaking them up a little bit if you've got a texture that's almost but not quite what you're looking for. It's also blurable. The opacity can be knocked down. You can see just a way of creating a more modeled and sometimes more interesting light source. The real power of this one is when you're working without a texture. It allows you to create something that can approximate a softbox. It gives you a nice controllable, customizable light source that you can vary up by if you wanted to repeat the light and not have to be exactly the same. Having that little bit of extra breakup can give you a nice look. The noise can also be tinted if you wanted to have a color version. This is again a multiplier in the base color. The light plane frame is a cropping type tool. Turn that on. Combined with the noise and a simple background color, it gives you that sort of softbox look, if that's what you're going for. But it's also useful just as a way of cropping your light and making it bigger or smaller, or clipping it. By default, the X and Y are linked together, so you see that controlling the X parameters drives both. But if we unlink that, we have separate control for the X and Y. Bringing the softness down, you can create a much more organic looking shape. And you've got rotations of both. So at full opacity, it clips the light, but it can be dropped down and just create vignettes or just different ways of making more interesting shapes in your light. We go back up to visibility in alpha. By default, it's set to use composited as alpha. What that's going to do is knock out the blacks and make them transparent. So if we just go back to the frames for a second. This is where you set everything back to default. Let's go on. The use a composited as alpha will take the combined result of all textures and adjustments and gradients and use the black to knock out the shapes to make floating light sources. Maybe a bit hard to see in this scenario. Let's make this a two-sided light. Maybe a little easier to see. There we go. So that's our black frame cropping the light, but by using composite as alpha, we can knock it out and make a soft edge light source. Contrast control over that. To a nice layer, an extra layer of opacity control. Again, if we bring these down, let's unlink them. By use composited as alpha, you can create nice soft edge gradient style lights. That lack hard edges. You can go up to the intensity. in and up a little bit. To this color, just a little bit dark tone. And you can create some really interesting light sources very, very, very quickly. Let's bring that on. The next sections are the gradients. There's two linear gradients, an X and a Y. Both are exactly the same, just rotated by 90 degrees, but because both have this rotation value, you can use them in whichever way you like. The offset control its relative position. I'm just going to turn that noise off for a moment. Quick way to get to that and quick controls is to type opacity and you get everything up here. We can just turn that one off. Type linear and we isolate these controls. So the linear gradient provides a way of creating fall off in your reflection. Rotation, value of 1 is a full rotation, 0.5 is a 180-degree flip. Of course, if your offset is set to anything other than 0, you're going to have to realign it when you do that. And when the scale and the offset are working together, sometimes it's a little bit finicky. But rotating through 0.25 allows you to rotate 90 degrees, which would be equivalent to turning on the white gradient. Having them both fully adjustable means you can create all kinds of complex overlays and mixing and matching of colors because they also provide a color control. They don't just have to be a gradient luminosity fall off. You can create multicolored light sources as well. Something I forgot to cover, I'm just going to jump back over to the linear gradients. Both of them, in fact also the radial gradient, have a multiplier, which allows you to create repetitive patterns. This lets you create strip lights and all kinds of different things. And just around the scale. So all kinds of interesting things are possible. Just invert these by flipping the black and white colors. So that provides quite a range of potential shapes you can create with relatively simple tools. Last section for the light itself, the light plane itself, I should say, is the radial gradients. Let's just turn this one off for clarity. Radial gradient is pretty straightforward. Creates a radial gradient. By default, it's acting as a vignette on the light. You've got scale controls, contrast controls, opacity control. You can invert it if you wanted to create a dark spot in your light. Sometimes this is actually handy as a way of controlling a hot spot and just knocking back your intensity in a key place. The main advantage of having this inverted version, though, is by going into negative opacity and creating a hot spot on your light. Just take the intensity a little bit down over this will be easier to see. Sometimes this is useful to create a more natural looking light source. Typically softboxes or scrims will have a light inside. The idea behind them is to diffuse that light source and create an even source of illumination, but real lights often have at least a subtle hotspot. And this can be a really nice tool to create more interesting gradation in your lighting as well. If we just soften that out quite a bit, example, and then we stretch it. A little bit. Using the offsets, you can create an extra level of fall off in your light. And by moving around, you can put fall off in pretty much any direction you want. Of course, all of these can be mixed and matched together. Let's put our texture back on. And the radial. Put it back in the middle. So we set our scale here. Of course, you can tint that as well. Something we didn't cover, but easy enough to do. Similar to the linear gradient, the radial gradient also has a multiplier, which gives you a way of creating spotlights, rapid spotlights, dark spots. All kinds of options. Mixing and matching between the various gradients gives you an almost limitless range of potential textures. Again, we have the global controls, which we spoke about earlier. We'll come back to these now, the global light plane. The global contrast will account for the texture, all the gradients, and give you a way of fine-tuning the composited look. Brightness. Saturation where relevant. If there's a bit more color, you can add it or take it away. You can also tint the combined result. And inverting is also over there. That pretty much covers the light itself. Using all of these together provides pretty much everything you might need for a customized and highly controllable light source. The last thing to look at is the gobo plane. Gobo, sometimes called a cookie, sometimes called a gobo. Essentially, it's an object that goes between your light source and your subject and provides a way of modifying or controlling that light. Sometimes that's to create interesting shadow patterns. Sometimes it's just to tone down the light in selected areas. Note I've turned on the spotlight because it's a little easier to see it in action with the harder light source. If you turn it on, by default it's going to knock your light out completely because it creates a black plane that overlaps your light. If we go in and grab it by its individual controls, you can see what it's doing here. Just reset that back to its default position. Sorry, show modified power should be turned off for convenience. It's set to hinge at one end to provide a quick way of creating a barn door style fall off of light. When manipulating it, you want to work it at the component level. You can play with its scale, you can play with its position. This will be very, very common with this type of tool. You want to create some feathering of light there. Reset that back. Let's grab just the gobo parameters for a moment. So obviously in its default position, it's going to be doing a little too much. But if we put a texture in there, you can see where it can start to act like a cookie. And create some pretty interesting shadow patterns. The sharpness will be controlled by the shadow sharpness of the light itself, but also you've got the blur level on the texture, giving you another level of control over that. Texture can be inverted. All the same controls we had before, contrast, tiling, etc. Rotation. All of these parameters, like all of the parameters in the light, are also animatable. So you can key them and have them adjust over time. Let's just reset that back to 0 for a sec. The frame, similar to the frame on the light source, provides a cropping tool, essentially, making your gobo bigger and smaller. See that from above, maybe a little bit easier. And there we go. Exact same controls. Flip around and use it to create a little window on your light. Again, by moving it around, you can affect what it's doing. Right now, the spotlight is obviously punching right through it, so it doesn't look like it's doing very much, but it can be dragged over to obstruct that as well. Just soften that contrast. Great. Nice little feathered edge on your light. Same thing is possible with the linear gradients. Let's just turn this off. This is a really powerful way of using the gradients in the gobo. Just to feather light ever so slightly. The X and Y work exactly the same. Just have to be aware of where the gradient is sitting in terms of scale and contrast. Just tweak away. The radial gradient creates, by default, it creates a hole in the middle so that it gobo becomes like a vignette for your light. That's invertible. One thing we didn't talk about with the other gradients is the multiplier. Once you start using the multipliers, you've got a pretty incredible amount of variety in the shapes and styles that you can create. All kinds of craziness. That gives you a pretty quick rundown. The aesthetics of this are obviously a bit of a mess, but hopefully you get the idea. Some of the examples you can find on the UltraLight page, linked below, to give you an idea of what you can do with it. If you have any questions, please post them in the comments below, and I'd be happy to answer them.